Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that all of you are here. I'm Susan Zieger. I'm a professor in the English department, and this is the Global 19th Century Studies Group Roundtable, our first event for this academic year. We are having this event on Indigenous Peoples Day, which is hopefully a fortuitous convergence, and maybe that topic will come up in some of our remarks. So I'm joined by Heidi Breivik-Zender and Jonathan Eckert and Fatima Quraishi, and we've been organizing this group for several years, bringing speakers to campus, helping support graduate student research through our graduate student fellow program. And this year, we kind of thought we would highlight local talent by reaching out to colleagues who also work around the 19th century and, just sort of seeing what we might have to say to each other. So this is the first of 3 roundtables, 1 per quarter. And we also have some other events, people coming to give talks. But we're delighted to sort of invite colleagues from other departments and beyond the group to share their work and to accomplish this objective of kind of building our 19th century community together. So the emphasis on globality is, I think, going to help us cast a wide net and hopefully get away from a tired Eurocentric focus. And I think this is in keeping with the way the field has moved along in recent years, seen in the new emergence of journals like Victoriographies or the group, the Society for Global 19th Century Studies, of which Jonathan, you're a part. And that group is having conferences in Los Angeles next month and in Singapore next year. So today, we'll see how the global comes up. It might be in each of our projects. It might be in the whole of our projects as we talk together. We'll see what happens. So the idea is to speak briefly, like 5 or 10 minutes and extemporaneously about our research. And in that way, the connections can emerge in a conversation. And so I think it probably makes sense to kind of foster that by just having each of us talk about our research, those of us on the roundtable, and then like kind of, open it to questions, but like really, have the questions be, ones that we can all speak to, or we can sort of find ways to connect. And so it's less about like giving a presentation and like kind of defending the presentation, or if you catch my meaning. So there's a few of us speaking about our research, but really, like, even if you haven't been invited to speak like about your research, you can do that, and we'll kind of like, instead of like focusing it on a question, we can just kind of think of all different ways to make this an organic conversation that supports everybody who wanted to come. So I hope that makes sense, and I'm just trying to like loosen up the standard format of how these things work. All right. So did anyone have any questions before we kind of get underway? I can't see everyone, but I'm not seeing any. So I think I'll just start talking about my research, and then we'll move on to Alejandra, Fatima, and Fuson. And then we have our graduate student fellow, Andrew, will be joining us a bit late. He had a conflict with the class, but he'll kind of like be our second act of the day as we kind of move through the event. So, okay, so I'm working on logistics. Many of you know that because I've been working on it forever. It's a huge topic. And it really began as a 19th century project because its roots remain 19th century. But it kind of, logistics is an effect of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of imperialism and colonialism, the modernization of warfare. It's certainly, there are ancient logistics, because as long as people have engaged in commerce where they had to transport things, as long as they've made war on each other, people have had to move goods, other people, and information from place to place efficiently to optimize value or profit. So the definition of logistics that I'm using. But, the real interest in logistics, I think, those of us who are interested in the 19th century want to know, perhaps, but like really it goes beyond the 19th century. And I found that people are very interested in this project insofar as it's about stuff we're facing right now with disrupted supply chains, warehouse workers striking, possibly a new phase of globalization as a result of these pandemic supply chain disruptions. So there's so much to say about logistics, and I feel like I want to say all of it. So the project has really become like 1750 to the present, starting with the slave trade, the transportation of people, the violent transportation of people as commodities. I feel like it's an important first modern point at which the human and the logistical kind of really converge and coincide. And so it makes logistics a human experience. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, like how we are living logistical lives, how different people live it differently. What is it like to, have a logistical subjectivity, perhaps? So, starting there and then to the present, where we have people trying to remake the moon into a logistics platform for, non-terrestrial logistics is kind of mind-blowing. And so that's kind of, the huge sweep. It's a project that has an enormous scale. So the argument is just that modernity is fundamentally logistical, and that it obliges us to survive the pressures of class, race, gender, and sexuality through an ethics of efficiency and precision, and that this is kind of a mimicry of capital. So logistics in supply chain management has to do with how materials and goods are brought to the right place at the right time, to yield value and optimize profit. And the bywords of this are things like leanness and agility and flow and resilience. And these are all also kind of desirable psychological and personal attributes. So there's a real way in which we are our supply chains. And it's, the question of contemporary subjectivity and modern subjectivity is bound up in logistics as a heuristic for the way the world moves and changes. So the book has 6 chapters, and I explain how this develops using the metaphors and keywords that are central to logistics. So flow, box, the shipping container, the chain, handling. Handling is, the handling of goods, and it's a kind of very human metaphor that's about the human body, but it expands beyond that. Shelf life, this concept of making goods durable so that they can travel greater distances, and then how that relates to this sense of life and vitality of trade. And one I've been working on most recently is nightmare, the logistical nightmare. So this is where nothing goes right, everything fails at precisely the wrong moment. And that's a situation that comes to us from warfare and the military history of logistics. So, logistics develops as a word, a French word, logistique, in the 19th century in analysts of Napoleon's campaigns. They're trying to explain how Napoleon was so successful, and it's his incredible speed and movement, the ability to kind of move a group of 200,000 people, like soldiers and suppliers and everyone related to the camp, as much as 15 miles a day, is kind of an extraordinary logistical feat. And so they wanted to understand it. And the person who coins that term is Baron de Jomini. He's also in dialogue with Karl von Clausewitz, who writes on war and who famously sort of said that war is really just politics by other means. And so, of course, Foucault comes along and suggests inverting Clausewitz's aphorism to say that politics is war by other means, right? And so we have the militarization of society and this notion that the civil order is actually a kind of ongoing tacit form of war. This is clearly related to colonial administration. Achille Mbembe writes about the colony as a space of ongoing siege. And so you get nightmare situations such as the famine relief in Ireland in the 1840s, or famine relief in India in the 1890s. And these are absolute disasters where, as Mbembe kind of describes the ordinary life of the colony, it's like massacre combined with bureaucracy. And so these are kind of memorable episodes of that standard situation where, there's plenty of food for people. And this is the logistical irony, right? And this is the logistical irony of global poverty, right? Is that there's plenty of food to feed everyone, but we just can't get it to people, and seems like a technical failure of logistics, but of course it's not. It's about, the creation of capitalist value and the necro-political devaluation of colonial racialized life. So, you can see that in contemporary situations, the relief of New Orleans in Hurricane Katrina, or of Puerto Rico in Hurricane Maria in 2017. These are kind of like neo-colonial spaces where everyone's surprised that there's this logistical nightmare. Like, why is everyone sort of sweltering in the Superdome, and why can't we have trucks full of bottles of water? Why can't we get them to thirsty people? And again, it's like these underlying values that logistics sort of operates as the alibi for. So it's a little bit Naomi Klein and disaster capitalism, but I'm trying to focus it more precisely. So that's kind of the chapter on nightmares. That's what I'm working on at the moment. It combines the historical with the theoretical a little bit. And clearly it has a kind of global applicability, since it would be hard to find a region of the world that did not have some sort of moment of a logistical nightmare. So, okay, I think I will stop there and turn things over to Alejandra.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Susan, and everyone who does 19th Century for inviting us all to speak today and to have conversations. I always long to hear what other people at UCR are working on. It's so interesting. I was already like, oh, I have some questions, even though I'm going to speak of something really different. I want to just really quickly begin. We are this is Indigenous Peoples Day, and I just want to get us situated. I'm here in Riverside. This is the home of the Tongva, Luiseño, Serrano people, Cahuilla people. And I think it's just very important. It deals directly with my work. This is what I do. I do Indigenous history, but it lets us think about sort of the long array of the stories we tell. And even though we're rooted in places in time that are perhaps very different from today, sort of the long implications of that. And I think for me, doing land acknowledgement, which I know we can do as a checklist now and then move on, but for me, sort of a very conscientious rooting of the stories we are telling and how they have deep roots and deep historical iterations that continue to today. And as a historian, of course, I'm like, everything has this deep root that we need to trace back. But today of all days, I have that sort of pressing on my mind. I can't think of like a smooth transition between Susan's work and mine. So I'm going to say there isn't one. It's like as jarring as it goes. I love being an interloper in 19th century stories. I cannot even bend backwards and pretend that I do. sort of work that's even rooted in the 19th century, but I would like to say that I do work that is foundational for people who are studying the 19th century. I'll talk very briefly about two things that I'm doing to sort of connect or erase questions. So I just finished a book. It's in production right now. It's in proofs right now. Yay! So that's really exciting. And it's called Talking Back: Native Women and the Making of the Early South. And thank you, Jonathan. And it's really what I'm going to say. It should be something that makes me proud, but also makes me very sad. It's actually the first book to sort of situate Native women in a way in this region of the world in this period of time. And I mean that because there's like fantastic work done, especially by Native Indigenous scholars, of this period of this region, which is the American South that I look at, but not of the time period that I look at, which is the very early period. So the 16th, 17th, and a little bit of the 18th century. This book went into the 18th century, which for me is like modernity. So it was a really big sort of stretch thinking about how far in time to tell the story. But it makes a very simple, sort of straightforward argument about the importance of Native women in the making of this world, and that they had power shaping the world they inhabited. And I kept thinking, Susan, of your work, thinking about logistics. Part of the arguments of the book, it's like, these are the people that are keeping the region fed. These are the people that are keeping the lands improved. These are the people that are connecting towns and helping define territoriality and safety. Women are really shaping the fight against colonial powers, and their adaptability is allowing them to respond to a lot of the stresses of the colonial world, ecological as well as political. And I really began writing this book by accident as a result of finding primary sources on women and not being a gender historian by training, really being very sloppy at my first goes at thinking through women, thinking through gender, thinking about what I was going to say. And then, of course, thinking through the intersections that are here in this book about power, about class, about race, that are all coming together as I began through sources that are, of course, are rooted in the Spanish and colonial world. And then, of course, thinking about what they let me see, how they let me interrogate, how they let me tell stories of Indigenous women. But, and this gets to my very first points with the land acknowledgement, is all this work is done in conjunction, collaboration, thinking of Indigenous people as active, living, participant people today who I see my job as is helping support, helping augment voices. So two projects I'm just going to put on the chat as a way to show off are community-based projects that I'm doing working through languages. The first one works through Colonial Valley Zapotec. The next one is one that I run myself as a PI, which works on the Timucua language. So both of these projects are rooted in thinking through and working through colonial Indigenous-based sources, so sources that are produced in the colonial period. Some of them actually, this gets me to the 19th century. Some of them, especially in the Zapotec, get me through sources produced, documented, and published in the 19th century in Indigenous languages. And what is our responsibility and obligations with this text? So where I just finished a book, and so the question, everyone's like, okay, what comes next? And I'm like, a drink is what comes next, but I can't, and this is being recorded. I'm already in trouble, but pushing conversation forward is what comes next. What are my next items of interrogation? I can't articulate such a clear third project yet, but these work on contemporary languages and thinking about how to make those voices sort of at the center for my story, combining work that I do a little bit with archaeology, but mostly with linguistic anthropology and linguistics, is the core of what I'm thinking about next, really taking seriously language, not just doing one word analysis, which historians are notoriously known for, especially when Indigenous languages, but doing something much more robust and thinking through what it means to work with these colonial sources through Indigenous voices and languages. So that's where I see sort of this projects coming together. Gender's at the root of all these projects in so many ways, thinking about whose stories we have, how do they put together, and what language really lets us see. So I'll stop there. I couldn't think of a really great tie into Susan's yet, but thinking about how the colonial world comes to continue and inform our everydays, it sort of remains a very important point for me.
Thanks, Alejandra. Fatima, I think you're next.
Great, thank you very much. Having been away for a year from the Global 19th Century Group, it's really nice to be back. So thank you, Susan, for the invitation. Even though I'm a member of the organizing committee, I'm not really a 19th century historian. I spend most of my time in the late medieval, early modern. So Alejandra, I don't think you should feel like an interloper at all. We can talk about the long histories. And in some ways, actually, I think the last point that you brought up about the colonial setting up how we think about our everyday lives and today is a good one for a sort of segue to mine and where I am in my current book project. Can I share my screen? I do have some images, and I think it's disabled. I'll
try to, I think maybe if I make you a host, is that how you could do it?
I think that should work fine.
I should know how to do this, but if
can you go to participants and then like select me as a co-host or something?
Yeah, okay. Let's see. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, sorry, there's a million people in participants that are not actually here.
Anyway, while we're sort of figuring this out, my book project, which is entitled Necropolis's Palimpsest, is about a cemetery in the south of Pakistan known as Makli. And the project, in sort of broadly speaking, oh, great, this will help. Let me share this. Can everyone see? Perfect. So the project is about a necropolis in the south of Pakistan known as Makli, and the focus of the project primarily is a long history of the building of the site between roughly 1380 and 1660. And what the specific part that I'm going to talk today is a sort of a broader study within the book about funerary architecture in South Asia. And to situate us where we are, Makli is very close to the medieval Emporium of Quetta, in the Indus Valley Delta region, so in the Indus River's Delta region, in the Deltaic Plain. And there are a variety of ways in which we can think about or write about the history of this site. And one of the ways in which the site can be talked about is it through a sort of material typological analysis where we think about the different types of monuments. This is not to scale, but what you're looking at right now is a site that covers about 4 square kilometers and has over 75 monuments that are extant today. So it's an incredibly large site. And so the problem of dealing with or writing about a site of such complexity sort of necessitates essentially a variety of angles. And one of the ways in which I'm talking about it is through this, different materials of construction, different methods of construction. And another way of talking about it is to think about it through a sort of linear chronological development, where you can break the site down into multiple sort of registers of time, and think about different sort of dynastic entities and their relationship to the site. I should point out, it's a site where there are multiple royal funerary tombs, as well as saintly spaces, so shrines that function till today. So it's in its essence is a very complicated site. And in trying to figure out how to write about it, one of the parts of the project that I've thought a lot about is if we write these long histories of funerary monuments where we're essentially layering a variety of approaches to it, is there something to be said about funerary architecture in South Asia even more broadly, that this site kind of helps shed light upon, and the sort of the complicated histories of mausoleums and shrines in South Asia. And so I've been working on a chapter in the project about funerary sites in South Asia more broadly, and it deals with 3 distinct cities in India, Pakistan, and one of them is the city of Ssebulime, which is a little north of Makli in Pakistan, and is the site of a saintly shrine that for a saint Lal Shehbaz Qalandar, who died in 1274 and remains a very, very important shrine in Pakistan today, possibly the most important shrine in Pakistan today. Then you have the city of Delhi, which has not one, but scores of funerary monuments, some more famous than others, but just sort of it kind of permeates the city, this sort of notions of death and cemeteries and more elaborate funerary spaces. And then finally, the third example is the city of Bidar in the Deccan Plains, which has the Ashtur necropolis, which is the necropolis of the later Bahmani kings who ruled in the 14th, 15th century. And the necropolis dates from about 1436 and is built upon till 1528, I think, which is the end of the dynasty. And so these three very different sort of sets of monuments, which come about, have very different histories. How can we look at, what does looking at them together tell us about this kind of history? And one of the things that I was noticing in all of them was, these are sites that remain occupied for many, many centuries. And the ways in which they get used over the centuries seems to be quite similar. They all become at some point associated with Sufi saints. Even what is, in the case of Bidar, a royal necropolis, eventually takes on a sort of saintly character and becomes a gathering point for many communities, sometimes not just Muslims, but also many non-Muslim communities. And as I was doing this research, the 19th century comes up at a moment in which these kinds of linear trajectories and sort of parallel trajectories seem to transform a bit. And that is in part due to British engagement with these spaces and how different ways in which colonial administration responds to these spaces, how they document these spaces, and also how they legislate these spaces really transforms their trajectory. And that transformation has important ramifications for the 20th and 21st century in how the government of now Pakistan and India think about these sites in very different ways. And to give you, beyond the map, to give you a sense, I can't even show you an image of Sevan in the past because the entire site is new now, a new construction. So we have these kind of piecemeal inscription / remnants of earlier histories. So the top image is a rubbing of a 14th century inscription. The one on the right is probably from the 17th century, and the one at the bottom is an 18th century metalwork screen. But this is what the shrine looks like today. And it probably never looked like this prior to the 20th century. It was rebuilt in the 1990s. And the involvement of the government with this shrine is not as a government administering a historic site. It's the government administration of a religious site and its involvement in sort of endowments with the site and all kinds of ritual practices take place in the site. So the government intervention is very much related to pilgrimage economies and also sort of regulating what kinds of practice can happen in these spaces, and to a large extent undercutting the political power of the sort of traditional custodians of the site. So the government involvement is very, very precise in these kinds of ways. In the case of Delhi, we have so many different monuments, and and many of those are monuments that become protected in the 19th century under the Archaeological Survey of India. And I'm not the first person to write about this, and really I'm relying on the work of other art historians and historians, such as Muralini Rajagopalan's work, where she talks about how the ASI's language really deadens these monuments. These are monuments for dead people, but they are very important, vibrant sites in prior to the 19th century. And there's a very sort of distinct moment in which these sites are becoming historic and not having a present history. Which is not the case for all monuments in Delhi. Some of them remain very important functioning shrines today, but there is this distinct moment in which the language of the colonial administration through the ASI is used and continues to be used by the government of India to create sort of a distinction between a monument that is historic and set in the past and remains in the past, and those that have some kind of present history. And, you know, we can talk at length about what that means today, particularly with the Modi government and how they use this kind of language for their own particular political agendas. And that has also happened in the case of Bidar with the Ashtur necropolis, which up till the early 20s, even now, remains a site where you have this very important set of pilgrimages, where when the death anniversary of the saint is celebrated, where Hindu communities, particularly Lingayat communities, are also involved, and it's a sort of interfaith festival that is now spoken about in India. You know, there's like local reporting on it about how it's like this space of interfaith harmony, but has recently become more and more Brahmanized, even though historically the Lingayat community is not Brahmin, is not of upper caste. So it's this kind of usage of how this particular kind of language use. And the Pakistani government does it as well. It just does it to very different aims than what the Indian government does. But the 19th century, in a sense, becomes this kind of important moment in which government intervention transforms, and its way of dealing with these sites transforms. And so that's where I'm at, and, you know, it's interested to hear, you know, what thoughts people have about this. Let me stop my share if I can somehow. There we go.
Thank you, Fatima. Fuson, you're next.
Right. Thank you. I think it keeps telling me my internet connection is unstable, so that's why I had to turn off my video. Hopefully everyone can hear me. It's thumbs up, everyone? Yes? Okay. So I'm, and sorry if my internet connection cuts out. So thank you, Susan, for inviting me to this Global 19th Century Group meeting. In hindsight, it might not have been the best choice because I'm at a weird stage in my research trajectory right now. I'm going through tenure review right now, so it's more like I have work that has been done, and the work that I'm thinking about right now is still very skeletal. So maybe people can help me sort of come up with ideas about this skeletal third project. So I'll probably talk about the two books that I've finished and talk about how the third book project is going to be influenced by some of the open questions that were left from my first two book projects. So I'll talk about the first one first. It just came out in July. It's called A Brief Literary History of Disability. And it actually has a kind of weird origin story. I might go through some of that. It was as Alejandra and I were actually in the Huntington for 2 years of fellowship. But I was in fellowship during the pandemic year. So we were sort of kicked out of our offices in the Huntington, and we were sort of, we only had half a fellowship year, and our research questions in the archives were left half unanswered. So originally I had planned to go into those archives to think about Romantic era disability, so early 19th century disability, and to sort of try to figure out how to write disability history, even if traces of disability are sort of systematically erased. Erased from the archive. So I was planning to, for example, I was planning to go through the Lee family letters at the Huntington. The Lee family is the maternal side of Jane Austen's family. And it turns out I was very interested in one of Jane Austen's siblings, George Austen, and he had a mental disability, and his kind of lived experience of disability was one of those things that was systematically erased from the archive. So I thought maybe by going through the Lee family papers, I would find at least some trace of it. What I found were, very frustrating silences that I struggled to amplify and animate sometimes. And the sense I got is that George was neither to be seen nor talked about in the family. So it was very hard to find that kind of that trace of disability representation in the 19th century archive. So the pandemic actually shaped for me a kind of answer to this question. So instead of like very traditional archive work that I was planning to do, I turned to works of Black feminism and queer studies that helped me think about the archive in a kind of more theoretical orientation. So specifically, I was reading Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being, where she argues that the history of Blackness has not meant, traditional, conventional archival work, but what she calls wake work. And I'm sure this is probably a familiar work to many of you. So she riffs creatively and anachronistically on what she calls on that titular word wake. So it can mean the perturbed path behind a slave ship. It can mean a funereal practice. It can mean a clarifying arrival to consciousness and conscience. It can mean many things. And this kind of anachronistic shifting between that very conventional historical archive and kind of contemporary theory and practice, I think has really shown up in the most impactful work in Black feminism and queer studies specifically. So I thought maybe I could take inspiration from that and learn from them that, recovering Black, queer, or disabled histories shouldn't actually hinge solely on a kind of strict adherence to a historical archive that is systemically inflected by violence and erasure. What I saw specifically in my field in romantic studies 1780 to 1830, what I saw was work like Issaka Joshua's recent book published, I think in, 2020, called Physical Disability in British Romantic Literature. That's sort of what I'm used to in the field of romantic studies, that so she's basically arguing that we have to strictly adhere to that historical archive, talk about period-specific group terms. We can't even use the word disability. That word is inflected by contemporary theory and has no use for romantic studies. And she's she's so interested in collecting those historical specific group terms that she has like this 14-page appendix of words that people have used from 1700 to 1946 about people with disabilities. So she argues that our own kind of meta-narratives in contemporary disability theory are not useful to talk about romantic era disability because it flattens out that kind of historicist nuance that she wants to get at. I was thinking, just reading these two sets of work, there were at least kind of two sets of answers to my research question about how to write disability history. And in the end, I think the pandemic made the choice for me. Because I was denied access to the archive, so I couldn't do Issaka Joshua's work. And Issaka Joshua wrote her book, I think, well before the pandemic, or did the research for her book well before the pandemic. And she relies mostly on British archives. And so the pandemic, forced me to think about creative anachronism more. So in A Brief Literary History of Disability, the book that just came out, I try to do Christina Sharp's kind of wake work. I pair in my Brief Literary History of Disability, I go from early modern to contemporary. I pair some of the most kind of canonical stories and narratives we've told with very contemporary 20th and 21st century disability theory in a deliberate kind of anachronism that creatively tries to bring out disabled lives that have been erased from the past, right? So that's that first project that came out. My the next project that will come out next year is on smallpox, and that has more of a kind of medical and health humanities focus. So again, the pandemic was very influential in shaping the kind of contours of this project, of course, because it was about vaccination. So the kind of elevator pitch version elevator pitch kind of version of the argument there is that the advent of vaccination was as much a kind of literary discovery as it was a medical one. So I pair like Edward Jenner's work on the variola vaccinae with Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads in 1798. I talk about how in the Romantic era, there was this kind of medical literary language or medical literary idiom that shaped and made possible the discovery of vaccination. So just some contemporary implications of the argument. Originally, I had planned, and again, this is the pandemic sort of shaped this argument for me. Originally, I had planned that, you know, maybe the book could sort of speak to our current anti-vaccination crisis and convince maybe anti-vaxxers that there is this kind of deeper history to vaccination that they're not aware of and maybe change their minds. But what I quickly learned after talking to some anti-vaxxers is that I think they're too far gone, and I don't think my book is actually addressed to that audience. My book is actually addressed to a kind of an audience of like us, where the onus of changing the minds of anti-vaxxers is a kind of more systemic issue about changing our kind of healthcare industrial complex to value patient-centered care and to value what I call in the book the romantic illness narrative. So what my argument is mostly in the book is that we have lost the ability to listen, value, and honor illness narratives. And that is why anti-vaxxers feel that they are not heard and are making up these kind of conspiratorial stories about their own bodies. So part of the argument of the book is trying to get us to look to the historical past to learn from them about how to value the illness narrative. Okay, so that's the second project. So the open questions left that I had for my third project is first how to write disability history, how to figure out how to go through the actual traditional conventional archive and think about illness, disability, debility. And from the vaccination project, the open question I had was about how romantic medicine sort of shaped our kind of modern understanding of healthcare and what it means to live, what it means to flourish as a human, right? So my third project, again, this is very skeletal, so I'll just sketch it out skeletally, is about age studies. I'm trying to bridge medical humanities and disability studies because traditionally those two fields have you know kind of a beef, right? They don't like each other because disability studies activists do not like the word medical, and medical humanities don't like disability studies because they think it's all about social construction and not about the real lived experience of bodies. So I feel like in my third project, I kind of want to bridge that gap by talking about 19th century notions of age and longevity, and to sort of bring in both the discourse of disability and the discourse of narratives around illness and actual real lived experience of ill bodies. It's very preliminary. The only work that I've published so far from that third project is on Percy Shelley's The Triumph of Life, and it has to do with disability studies and age studies both, right? So it's trying to bridge that gap through Percy Shelley's weird, unfinished last poem. And I could talk more about that if people are interested, but I think I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Fuson. And thanks, everybody. I think we have a few minutes before Andrew arrives. This was almost perfectly timed for him to just show up and speak, but it's okay for it to be messy, I think. So, would anyone like to just sort of jump in and kind of share a question? And you can just sort of unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it in the chat, whatever suits you.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Heidi. Thank you so much. This has been something I've looked forward to this discussion for many, many weeks, months, because I really think it's long overdue for us to all get in a room, even that Zoom room, together and just chat and share, what it is that we do and how it relates, sort of in some ways more directly, in some ways less directly with the 19th century. But I think it works because even people who aren't working specifically in the 19th century have been showing us how their work informs that of those of us who are in the 19th century. So I just want to thank all the speakers so very much. I had a question. I guess the question is sort of for Alejandra, but it's for everyone here. And Fuson was also sort of talking a little bit about how we come up with projects and kind of what happens when we first start working on, say, a second book project, which is, sometimes very unrelated to the major work that we completed, right before that. And Alejandra, you just said something about, I think you said, you didn't feel that, gender history was sort of new for you. And you said something like, and you began clumsily. And I love that sort of honesty. And I wondered if you, or if anyone else, who's sort of starting the new project or remembering back to when they were working on that, at that stage of the project, the clumsy stage, how you sort of negotiated that clumsiness and turned it into something, productive. So it's really for anyone, but if Alejandra wants to speak specifically about, her experience, that'd be great. Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. I mean, I really think it's hard, right? I'm teaching a methods class right now for undergrads. So I'm thinking a lot about how we go about doing the work we do and trying to put order to the madness or to the stumbling that often happens. And I think for me, there's the balance of just the utter wonder that a new project often brings, because you often embark on something new, not knowing it, right? Like this is why you go about it. And so a lot of things at first really appear new and you get excited. I get excited about a lot of things. And as I told my undergrads, like I had a lot of my first presentations where some very kind, caring feminist scholars came up to me afterwards and said, Alejandra, we're so excited for this project. I'm glad you're here writing on women's history. We've been here a while. So maybe, you want to tone down the fact of your novelty is novel for you. It's not novel, so that was it was very exciting, very humbling, but that, right, when you enter into new projects, you really are entering into fields that are new for you, but that truly do exist. So part of the humbling for me and the stumbling is learning the vocabulary. As Fuson, as you're talking, like, how do I do this kind of work? How do I write a disability history when we have these fields that are like fighting with each other and you're trying to like create spaces between them? And I think it's exciting. It's humbling for the amount of work that you need to do. But I think that's where the new questions come, right? So I didn't train in gender history. I read a ton and I audited classes, I did all this work, but I was coming always from a really different kind of place and asking questions. And that served me well too with this project as well. So I think the stumbling is about being, at least for me, is a willingness to admit how novice I am, even if that unfortunately is reminded to me in a conference setting, but also the importance of just trying and, keep asking the questions you have, keep going back to it and never losing that wonder, because that wonder that you bring to the topic that is new for you is worth, even if it's not all of it is new, that is worth sort of interrogating.
I think I'm still in the awkward phase of my project. My project is like in a protracted adolescence, where it is just like sort of falling all over the place. And I think for me, it's the form of the project and sort of, taking up a massive topic and then figuring out how to like kind of make the first cut into it and start conceptualizing it in a way that, can be conveyed to other people at the same time that you're trying to specify the audience. And I think if the audience is always stable and you always know that you're only writing for 19th centuryists or like people who studied the British 19th century or whatever it might have been, maybe that's easier. But it's as the ideas come in, and Alejandra, you were just talking about the wonder of like, these are new ideas. It feels, you feel alive as you're encountering them. And they're not new to everyone. But like, as that process is happening, and then you're thinking about how to synthesize these things and bring them to other people, reconstellate them. I mean, that's kind of what we do, and hope to discover something new in the process. It's, the project grows and shrinks and like develops like strange protuberances and like has stubs and bits that, fall off and then get reattached. And so it's like this total like Frankensteinian kind of thing. So it's kind of, I don't know, I'm always clumsy and awkward with it. I think I finally eventually settled on something just because like it organically like reached a point where I'm like, this now has to take some sort of final shape. So literarily, like I was writing it in vignettes and they were like very gnomic and people couldn't really get their head around them. And like, it felt like prose poetry. And then I was like, okay, well, I don't want to write like a standard chapter. That's kind of where I've ended up. In a way, I'm writing it as chapters, standard chapters, but they are written in like mini essays that are connected. So it was just sheer trial and error and stumbling around that I finally arrived at that. So for me, it was less about the archive and more about refashioning the archive on the page.
Yeah, I remember the vignettes. Thank you.
Thanks. I've done a lot of talking, so I can create questions, but I would really rather create more space for others to ask questions. So at the risk of like having moments of silence in which people might be thinking, I feel like that ultimately might be more helpful. So I will pause and see who else wants to say something or tell us about your research. And it doesn't have to be in the form of a question.
So can I ask a question, Susan? I think,
yeah, for sure.
I think this is more for Fatima and Fuson. I was thinking about the sources that you're looking at, Fatima, especially as you were sort of describing all the different kind of both shrines, but also how the spaces have been changed. I was just thinking of all the different kind of materials or documents and the like that you're having to sift through. And Fuson too, as you spoke very candidly about sort of like what the pandemic has done to rethink our research, to rethink how we ask questions and sources. So I'm just really curious about sort of your process, because both of your projects have like such wide repertoires of materials. So I just wanted to like hear your thoughts about how you sort through them, or anything you want to sort of say about the sort of a massive amounts of sources that you're working through. And also, like, I'm personally always fascinated by sort of the real, I think, Fuson, for your comments about sort of the violences that are in our archives. These sources, as you're talking, they're radically different and unequal in their production and preservation. So I guess any of that you want to riff on, I just would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is a really good question. And, when I first started writing this chapter, I wasn't intending to do kind of original research. It was supposed to be a kind of literature review. I was like, there's research out there on this material. And then it's finding kind of the gaps and who has been interested. So Seven, for instance, is like, anthropologists love to write about Seven, and it's all like the 20th century and the 21st century beautifully, you can find out so much about it. And then you start digging into the history and there's nothing. And I kind of was like, okay, here's an inscription. What kind of information can I like sort of wring out of this inscription that's going to stand for a century or 2 centuries? Like, this is what we know for this century. And so there was this kind of like weird unevenness because of how people have thought about, how academics have thought about this site, but also because people are constantly wanting to make anew a place. And the British are like, they come in, and in some ways it's great, but it's like a really weird sort of set of documents, because the thing that I'm mostly relying on for the 19th century for a place like Seven is the gazetteers. And these are such a strange category of information. It's not a site that's getting historically preserved, but it's being written about in this semi-ethnographic way with like gestures towards a kind of linear chronology of a site. And so it really is like trying to figure out, like, rather than trying to find some kind of equal ground for them, I think that what I ended up doing for a lot of this material was to be like, what are the motivations behind each of these in each period, and can we make like broader arguments based on that, rather than worrying about these massive lacuna. I think, like, at the outset, I kind of point out that these are very uneven histories, and that they come with their individual sort of biases over time. And in many ways, the language or the material really speaks to those kind of biases very well.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, part is my naivete. Like, I was trained as a very kind of historicist kind of scholar, like going into the archives very traditionally, expecting to find like evidence of things. So like, actually, I mean, like, that moment of wonder was, for me, was like, I was reading Black feminism and queer studies, and I was like, these are things that, you know, that normally don't seem to like get into like these kind of conventional archive studies. But I was sort of just surprised by that, and I figured that, you know, there were probably two ways of looking at it. And my very skeletal third project is trying to figure out, like, is there a way to bridge those two approaches, the kind of creative anachronism that I described with Christina Sharp's work, and the kind of Isaka Joshua type kind of conventional archive work, right? So I don't actually have those answers yet, because again, my third project is very skeletal. So ideally, I would like a way to look at those, for example, those Lee family papers, and to maybe like find a trace of George Austen's life. I mean, he is mentioned occasionally, but again, like in very kind of euphemistic and just in very kind of euphemistic ways. So I'm not quite sure. And Alejandra, you probably have better answers to this, because you're used to, you know, doing this kind of work. But so I would like to actually hear how you approach this subject. But for my third project, I really want to figure out a way to do that.
I mean, I wish I had like an answer. Do this, and then we have it. But I think, right, it's like, I think this is Black feminist studies in particular have really reshaped the way, you know, I'm thinking through colonial archives as well. And especially as I went to a project to sort of write women's history, where I was repeatedly told by other scholars, oh, there isn't a way to do this kind of work. Like, Native women are not in the archive. And I think one of the first things that, you know, struck me is actually they're in a lot of places in the archive. We just haven't seen them. And that lack of sight is a sort of a willful one too. Like, and it was willful for me too. Like, I didn't see them earlier either. And I think part of it is also how, like, where are we looking, obviously, for these materials, especially if you're doing Indigenous history without looking at Indigenous language sources or thinking through the actual material in those languages, you are going to miss a big chunk, right? So expanding your archives in a way that's profound really helps. So like, what we think counts as an archive, what we think counts as a source, and expanding that, obviously, to me, it's like, okay, first step in that process, but then also obviously thinking through the existing colonial sources. There are ways, like, I think for me, what shocks me is like how much they're there and how little we have, you know, worked through them. I think part of the shock for me in this project was I kept actually finding evidence of Indigenous women. It wasn't that I was like, oh, these small fragments that I have to like expand. It was like, I am sinking in evidence that we have not actually worked through. And it's that abundance that's just as problematic as that, you know, fragment, if we don't like analyze or think about it. So I think it's like, definitely for me, what's helped is definitely the expansion of that archive, right? Like, I had a story, but then I did interviews. I talked with community members, you know, like, I feel like, and that all created a much more robust way of thinking about the one story I had, and it gave me too much then, as opposed to the original fragment in the archive. I don't know if that's, I saw Andrew come in, right? So I'll be quiet.
No, I mean, yes, welcome to Andrew. I'm glad you're here after your class. Let me ask one more question, maybe, and then Andrew, give you a couple of minutes to kind of get acclimated, and then we'll, ask you about your research. This conversation has been making me think about the global 19th century, or the 19th century, like as a sort of absence, or it's this thing that like we are all, methodologically, archivally, disciplinarily kind of holding at arm's length, or like putting in suspension, or kind of, not quite, I don't know, and I think this is just, in keeping with what we all do and have been doing for a long time, is interdisciplinary work, and work that is like speaking to more than one field, right? So it just, I guess it makes me wonder, like, I celebrate this. I think it's a good thing. I'm down with everything that people are describing doing. I think it's tremendously fertile and productive. So it's good to get rid of the object of inquiry in a way, or to stretch it and deform it in creative, interesting ways. Does it matter, I guess, is maybe my question, or what does the 19th century or the global 19th century remain as? Like, is it kind of like a vibe, or like an idiom, or is there an object there that we have definite relations to? I'm just sort of curious, like, is it something that we can just sort of orbit and without like specifying? And does anyone miss having like a more sort of like sharply defined object to bring us together?
One thing I was thinking of, Susan, thank you for the question, was when Alejandra was saying that she isn't really a 19th century scholar, was so much of our sort of disciplinary scaffolding emerges in the 19th century. And in a way, we are constantly thinking through, at least for art history, you're kind of like pushing back against that foundational period of the field. And so in a way, the 19th century is always there, even though we don't want it to be, or even though we're trying very hard to get away from it. So if it's not the object, it's, it surrounds us in a very different way, whatever that might mean to us.
Okay, thanks, Fatima. I'll leave that trippy question then. Yeah, let's welcome Andrew. He's one of our graduate student fellows. The other fellows are also here. Thank you for being here. Andrew, we've just been talking informally, as I suggested, for about 5 to 10 minutes about our research, and then sort of asking these broader connective questions. So I'd love to welcome you and turn it over to you now, if you'd like to talk to us a little bit about your project.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Well, everyone, I'm so sorry, first of all, for being too late. This is the second time I missed the first meeting because of these clashing programs with the program. I didn't know how the program will roll out after the start. So I found out that there are many clashes in between. So that's why I pushed it to today. Still, I had to run from class, which ends at exactly 1:20. I had to rush to my this small office so I can have this conversation. Well, my name is Andrew Ssebulime. I'm a he, him, and I'm a first-year PhD student here at UCR studying critical dance studies. I am from Uganda, and I'm very interested in Ugandan folk dances. basically interested in performing studies, but Ugandan dances are very pertinent to me in my life and my career so far. A little bit of my passion and what sparked this kind of direction is my traveling, my life. I've been traveling to different places. I've lived in different countries for quite some time, and I've tried. I'm basically very careful, and I've been watching indigenous and folk dances from different countries and in different ethnic groups around. In China, for example, for 10 years, in the UK for a couple of years, in Norway, and I feel like something was really happening, and what is happening, I was looking at indigenous folk dances, for example, from the Chinese side. We would go for performances and you expect to find a Brazilian dance. Well, they market Brazil on stage and the people, yes, are Brazilians, but they're not doing samba, for example. And I had my conversation with some of these people and most of them were like, we're forced to actually do this, but because of money. So there's commodification of folk dances because, they need money and they're in China. So they literally abandon their culture because they want to get money. Well, I'm not against getting money because everybody wants to get money, but how are you going to get this money, which is a very important question to me. So I traveled to France and with the same idea, how do indigenous dances in France, with the transmission, I was looking at the transmission of these dances from the trainers, from the specific so-called qualified choreographers. How do they transmit these indigenous dances to other people? So to me, I had to experiment this in France. There was this conference that was happening. There's a workshop actually that was happening, and I had to arrange a bunch of other foreign students in my university, which was Clermont-Ferrand in France. And I wanted to experiment through teaching not my culture, but a Ugandan indigenous dance to these other people from different walks of the world. And my message there, what I was looking at is the ways of transmitting this dance, one, and the knowledge in these particular specific movements. Does the message go with the action, or they forget the message and they look at the beauty and the aesthetics and the keenness, all that. So I realized that it was important for me to actually take part and participate in that. And so my research here was basically to answer these questions of one, how the music and dance, that element, or the binary element of music and dance being together, is it inseparable or not inseparable in that particular dance? And then I was also looking at the way this transmission goes on, because you find yourself in such places that there is what is behind the backs of these dancers and the choreographers is money, not the message. But the culture bearers are losing a lot. If you showed that dance to a Brazilian, for example, in China, they'll say, this is not dance. Something different, this is not my dance. So my question as a researcher was, how can you transmit folk dances with their embedded knowledge system in there? And that brought up a couple of questions. There's decolonization, the way I would teach. And then there is also languaging, which is a very important part there. Languaging, how are you saying, if you say 1, 2, 3, do the culture bearers say 1, 2, 3? Maybe they say something, maybe they say sentence, which means something. Maybe it signifies a change in the pattern, or something might be happening. So my research was basically to look at the transmission modes of an indigenous folk dances, or an indigenous folk dance in the diasporic context, not in Uganda, but how does that process go on from transmitting the music and the dance, and how do the participants perceive this kind of process? Do they enjoy it? Do they learn something? Yes, basically, in a nutshell, that is my research, and it is an ongoing research. I have published this article already, but it is an ongoing research. I am in UCR now, I'm still carrying it on, and my class was still about that. The embedded knowledge systems in the transmission of these dances. How can we keep these particular knowledge systems? They might be indigenous dances. I'll call them indigenous dances because they're from the people. But then how can we keep this thread clear so that we connect the indigenous people, the culture bearers, and wherever this dance is end up. So that is basically my research. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That's so fascinating. I wonder, and my first question is sort of, if you get called, if you felt pressure to organize dances that would be going like exactly against the grain of like what you're trying to achieve, you know, because it feels like the genre of the dance is exactly, of indigenous dance is exactly what you're saying, that is put on in this performative way to like, you know, commodify difference in institutions. So I think it'll be interesting to, you know, think about your, like how might you program around that to like kind of, you know, destroy like the capitalist, you know, imperialist impulse there.
Yeah, well, I would say it's so hard to destroy that because we have two things here. We have the theatricalized performances, right? I mean, you train people this kind of dance for a particular stage. And then we have this social event on the social events. But my question is, regardless, whether it's going to be on a theater or it's going to be like in a compound somewhere, the knowledge should be passed on to whoever is learning this dance. That is my question. That is my point. Not the way they perform. They can do the way they can perform the way they want to perform, but do they understand why they're doing this movement? Do they understand why they're saying this particular word or sentence? What does it mean? Is that, to me, that is the energy that I'm looking at. It has been polarized. And, you know, like you said, capitalistic state, I mean, the state, everything is money, 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 yes. But then why are we forgetting our roots? And I don't feel comfortable to be somewhere and I see somebody doing my dance in a different way. Misappropriation is fine, but do they understand why they're doing that? That is my question, basically.
Susan, can I jump in with a question?
Heidi, yeah.
Heidi, hi. Andrew, thank you so much for that presentation. I work in French studies, so I was very intrigued by your discussion about indigenous dance in the French context. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about what that is. I just had not thought of indigeneity in relation to France and French history. So I'm very intrigued by that. If you could just tell us a little more about the project and the dance, you know.
Okay, some bit of the context. When I was in France for my master's degree in international dance in dance knowledge, practice, and heritage, in a university in southwestern part of France, Clermont-Ferrand, it's called University of Clermont-Auvergne. So my department organized a two days workshop, and I had previously informed my supervisors and my professor that I would like to carry on a research in this project, and they said it's okay. So what they did, they collected a couple of other students, international and French, local students, local people around the area, just to come and enjoy, just to come and be part of my project, basically to find out the transmission process. But I'm not really getting into the French indigenous dances. So it's not about French, it's about me teaching my indigenous dance to the French, to the wide spectrum, to the other people from the world, just that.
I see. No, that makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
I had a question kind of related to what, Andrew, you're working on, but also Fuson, what you were talking about. While you were talking about your work, I was thinking, you know, we talked about the limitations of accessing archives in the pandemic, but also the experience of the archive and like sort of the experience of the body in the archive or during the pandemic of not having access and being in the case of Fuson, like sort of experiencing on a very limited scale what it means to live a disabled and limited, perhaps limited with the, you know, how much interaction you have with the outside world, that kind of, what that does to your work. And sort of then bouncing off on that idea of the body, I was wondering, Andrew, if you could talk about, you know, how this is a very different archive that we're talking about, right? It was really an expansion of archive where we think of the indigenous body, like, how do we think about this? Not like, what is, how, where is this knowledge housed? Is it in the body? Is it like oral histories? Like, what are the archives here that you are talking about?
I love this question. Recently, I've been reading about student dance, duets, how interculturalism in a couple dancing in duets, like an international stage, or how South and East, like let's say an Asian and a European dancing doing a duet in Europe. So I mean, there is a lot that is happening when it comes to passing on the knowledge and keeping the knowledge to yourself. There's a lot of that. But when we look, for example, at my African performances in African dance, basically there is this lack of archivization, you know that. So there's little documentation of our works. And we believe that dance is not just a language, it is an archive. So what we're trying to do, what I believe is, in my country, there's what we call Ubuntu Bolamo, which means together. And there is an epistemology called Ubuntu epistemology, which is defined as you are because we are, right? You are because we are. So there's no individuality, there's no individualism in my culture. So what we believe in, that is exactly something I'm trying to do, is that because of that epistemological statement, we are looking for keeping our message, keeping our knowledge embedded in the practices that happen anywhere in the world. So we believe that I might not be able to stay in the US for the next 20 years, but at least if I taught somebody this particular dance, they know the message there and they know the music and the movement. So that is another way of archiving this body, the movements and messages as well, to me. So that is the drive that we're trying to work on, although there are a couple of other things to consider. For example, if we talk about decolonizing transmission process of folk dances, that is a very broad topic to handle. And I just want to touch a little bit of it, but I can't go in depth, because if you decolonize everything, you remain with what exactly? So there's questions of that. But getting back to your question, I believe by transmitting dance, we are actually archiving the dance itself. You transmit it, somebody learns it, well, you will, but the question would be, how are you transmitting this dance? You see, I mean, that would be the question. You're transmitting it, you're gonna learn the dance, and you present it for another day, another week, another year, even if I'm not there with you. So that is archiving it. But then the way I transmitted it to you is very important. If I didn't tell you why you're supposed to do movement A and you're supposed to say this word, then you will just take it like you just cram the work, but you have not done my work as a trainer, as a teacher. So to me, that would be the best way I would handle this, that we need to focus on the message as a way of having a full kind of archivization process, to me.
We have a few minutes. Anyone who hasn't spoken yet and would like to jump in with a comment or a question, you're welcome to do that. We see in the chat, Stephen has let us know that he's working on the Wolfgang Wolf Foundation. Thank you for that mention. If you want to say anything more, feel free to take a moment to do it.
I think Jonathan has a comment.
Oh, Jonathan.
Jonathan is here.
Hi, yes, thank you, Andrew. I'm curious if you could say more about how the global connections in dance appear in your research. I mean, do you see patterns of dance, motions of dance, ideas behind dance that emerge independently in different places that are similar? Or I guess I'm just curious about the kind of the ways in which I've never thought of dance potentially expressing similar things in similar ways in different places without communication. So without those things being transferred from one place to another, like is there any way in which that can be, for lack of a better word, organic? I hope that question made some sense.
Yes, thank you so much, Jonathan. Well, I'm just gonna go to another anecdote here now. I've been living in China for the last 10 years and I've been working with indigenous, African indigenous, Brazilians, Cuba, Russia, Ukrainians. And my role in the company was to choreograph and manage these people, these foreign artists in China. So they come to China with their indigenous, their folk dances, and it's let's say 1 year contract. So they stay there for a year in this specific place, let's say UCR, and then 4 years later, these people will not, I mean, they will live 1 year after, and then 4 years later, the Chinese will recreate the same particular kind of dance, and then they brand that, let's say, Russian dance, right? So there is this kind of like, I don't know if you get my point, that these people came with their indigenous folk dance, and it was actually very organic. But because first of all, it was expensive for the Chinese to handle for the next following years. So what they do is they replicate this particular performance, and they actually own it. They say, this is our dance. It can be a Russian dance, but then they have different costumes, but it is the same thing. So as a dance researcher, to me, a dance researcher and a dancer myself and a choreographer, that would be like very offensive in a way. And I believe this has been happening everywhere. I also went to Norway, Trondheim, Norway, and I was with this indigenous Nordic art group. It was from a small city called Oppdal, a small city in Norway. I went to do research about their indigenous dances and how they try to keep to preserve their cultures, right? Even though, I mean, there's globalization and everything. And the question and their worry was, we do not dance outside our city because we fear they will take our dance away from us. So because of this preservation and the fear of what they call globalization now, very many people are very skeptical about their dances, especially when it comes to indigenous dances. Modern dance and postmodern dances, oh, that's okay. But when it comes to indigenous dances, I think the culture bearer should have a very big say on how and when and who should actually have access to their dances. And if they say, how are they transmitting them? It should be, again, about the culture bearers. I don't know if I answered your question, Jonathan.
Well, I think my question was slightly different, but your answer was fascinating anyway. So I'm happy to listen to the answer that you gave.
All right, thank you. Susan, can I ask a question? Sorry, I missed the first introductions. I don't know who was presenting what. I'm curious, just out of curiosity. I don't know who presents what. I would like to ask as well.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a good point because we just sort of dispensed with introductions earlier anyway. So I'm Susan.
My apologies again.
No. It's we're glad you're here, and we're glad that it's a busy time of the quarter. So thanks to everyone for squeezing this in to their schedules in whatever way. So I'm Susan Zieger. I'm a professor in the English department, and I talked about my work on logistics, which is a kind of cultural history of logistics as a technique of management, as a colonial and civilian administration, as commerce, as warfare, through the metaphors that are used to describe it.
I talked next. I'm Alejandra. I'm a professor in the history department. I talked about a forthcoming book I have on Indigenous women in the American South, and also the importance of sort of expanding our archives and thinking through Indigenous languages and working with, alongside, Indigenous communities.
Hi, I'm Fatima Quraishi. I'm a professor in the art history department, and I was talking about my book project on the Makli necropolis in the south of Pakistan, and how I've recently been working on sort of a variety of different sites in South Asia, and how sort of a variety of funerary sites in South Asia, and what kind of colonial archives tell us about sort of contemporary engagements with these spaces, particularly vis-a-vis the governments of both India and Pakistan.
And I spoke next. I'm Fuson Wang. I'm an assistant professor in the English department. I talked about two previous book projects, one on disability studies and how to write disability history through the kind of literary canon. The second project was about smallpox vaccination, the history of smallpox vaccination, how it came out of a kind of medico-literary idiom in the early 19th century. All of that was to talk about the kind of skeletal outline of my third project, which is trying to bridge those two kind of competing fields of medical humanities and disability studies, which frequently don't like to talk to each other because disability studies views medicalization as a kind of bad word, and medical humanities views disability studies as mere social construction that ignores the existence of lived bodies. That third project, I hope to be about early 19th century constructions of age and longevity. And I talked about briefly one chapter from that project that has come out on Percy Shelley and his poem, The Triumph of Life.
Okay, I think actually that summary is a nice way to wrap up since we are out of time. And I will just quickly plug our next event, which is a Zoom visit from Lindsay Wilhelm of Oklahoma State University, who will be talking about Royal Hawaiian writing in the 19th century on December 1st, a Thursday at 4 p.m. So you'll get more information about that as it gets announced. And I think the last thing that remains is to thank everybody who came and shared their research and questions. It's wonderful to see all of you, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
This was so much fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Fatima, welcome back. So good to see you.